Right, this next section is the Empire of Rome. This is just kind of a rough time period after the fall of the Republic and before the Gothic Wars and the kind of collapse of the Roman Empire. Um, it's easy to divide everything into three big sections just to break it up so that it's not so overwhelming that you can actually learn the information. Now, we talked about Octavian last time. Octavian becomes Augustus. He literally changes his name. And this is after the defeat of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. And he becomes the undisputed emperor of Rome. And essentially, for the next 200 years, give or take, more or less, Rome enjoys relative peace. After about 180 AD, things begin to fall apart. But before then, Rome, the empire, expands to its full size. It grows to cover more than 3 million square miles, with something like 60 to 80 million people inside of it. A million of those people alone live inside the city of Rome itself. From Octavian, you get the first dynasty of Roman emperors, and these are called the Julio-Claudians. There's several of them. They're all related. Tiberius is kind of the first one. He is extremely cruel. He's ruthless and aggressive. Caligula follows after him. Caligula is insane, just dangerously insane. Claudius is known mostly for invading Great Britain and for real invading Great Britain, not like Caligula showed up and didn't have enough soldiers, and Julius Caesar even himself couldn't continue the conquest. So um, Claudius goes into Britain with enough troops to genuinely make a difference. Nero, again, is extremely cruel. He's most well known for tormenting some of the early Christians. And these men, collectively speaking, are not really the best material for a supreme ruler, especially in the case of Caligula. But we'll talk a little bit about Tiberius first. So, Tiberius had a real problem with paranoia. And the problem is he surrounded himself with people that also craved power greatly. Men like Sejanus over there on the side. And Sejanus was very clever, and he was able to play with Tiberius, kind of play with his mind, and work on that paranoia while simultaneously setting up Tiberius to fall. And Sejanus is a member of the Praetorian Guard. He's kind of like an elite um, military force that answers directly to the emperor. And as the Praetorian Guard, he's kind of playing both sides of the fence. It does put him in a position where he's very close to the emperor, and Sejanus orchestrates the deaths of essentially all manner of political figures and officials, members of Tiberius' family. And eventually, Tiberius realizes this threat, and he has Sejanus killed. And not just killed, but degraded. His body is thrown down a set of staircases, famous uh, staircase in Rome, and the body's torn apart by a mob of people. After the death of Sejanus, there's a man named Macro, and he's also a Praetorian Guard, and he is elevated to essentially the same position that had just been vacated by Sejanus. And we're not exactly sure his how deep his involvement is, but Sejanus may have actually conspired with Caligula to kill Tiberius. Mac, uh, yeah, Macro thought he could almost rule by default, similar to the way Sejanus was doing, if he could somehow control Caligula. And so, after Tiberius dies, Macro supports Caligula becoming the next emperor. And Sejanus had managed to kill all of the heirs apparent, with the exception of Caligula himself and Gemellus, which is who was Tiberius's grandson. But as after Caligula became emperor, he immediately has Gemellus executed. He then begins a very public and torrid affair with Macro's wife and essentially hounds Macro out of office until we get to the point where Macro just uh, kind of commits suicide out of his how horrible his life has become, having to leave politics and being shamed by Caligula, etc., etc. He chooses suicide rather than continue to live with the dishonor of the thing. Now, historically, Caligula is a real problem because he's so universally hated that many of the things that are actually written about him we have to treat as suspect. So these histories come down to us with all manner of crazy reports of things that he does. So the really obvious one and the most fun to talk about is the thing with the horse. So Caligula, his horse was named Incitatus, and he gave all manner of special honors and treatment to the horse. So it's reported that he made the horse a senator, made the horse a judge, um, and Caligula may have been using this like your grandma does with the dog that rides around in her little purse, right? Or he may have been using this horse and giving it these official titles and honors to insult the senators, which he hated. Um, so that's certainly a plausible um, idea, and it's also entirely possible that he was just flat out insane. So these are the questions that we have about Caligula, and it shows a weakness of the historical sources because if everybody hates him, they're certainly not going to write um, mostly truths or even half truths about him. They're going to make him seem as horrible and brutal and vicious and disgusting as they could possibly make him. And we do know that there is some truth to at least some of the reports about Caligula's behavior. He had very public sexual relationships with many of his counselors and generals' wives. He had very public relationships with all of his sisters, and all three of them. Drusilla was his favorite, and he would actually set up booths on the streets of Rome and charged admission for people to come in and sleep with his sisters. And this kind of outrageous behavior extends to um, all levels of Caligula's interaction with society. He has himself declared a god, and when he does that, he demands that a statue of himself be set up in the temple in Jerusalem. Um, that just that demand alone, you can just about imagine the response that that created for people that are extremely monotheistic and um, have a cultural religious heritage that goes back thousands of years. And there's plenty of evidence in terms of Caligula that if he isn't just flat out insane, he's at least, at the very least, an extreme sadist. And he's the kind of person that we would, label an outright sociopath today. The kind of Charles Manson type, where he has no feeling or compassion for anyone around him, and is just kind of walking through life as this extremely violent, highly sexualized id, just doing whatever he wants, whatever feels good at the time. And he's also very young, so he doesn't have a lot of life experience or as much life experience as some other people. And then you give them someone who's that young the position of emperor with all the power that they could ever want, and things like this are there's a great potential for things like this to actually come about. Now, in 1979, there was a film created which attempted to show Caligula in a totally different light, because almost universally everything that was written about him by contemporaries, ancient historians, is negative or shows him as evil, insane, violent, degraded, etc. But this movie called Caligula, 1979, shows him in a somewhat more compassionate light, focusing on some parts of the abuse he suffered at the hands of Tiberius. But it also doesn't spare you any of the extremely sadistic and raunchy details. And some of the stuff that's in this movie is just a beyond belief. It's not even pornographic. It's just it's difficult to describe. But I'm absolutely 100% serious. Do not watch it with your mother. You are simply not prepared to have any of those kind of discussions with your mother. After Caligula, the Praetorian Guard elevates his uncle, and his uncle is Claudius, to the emperor to become emperor. And where others have failed, like I said, including Caligula, Claudius invades uh, Britain. And of course, in Latin, it's known as Britannia. And he brings enough troops with him to actually complete the conquest. And what the Roman army encounters is a countryside that is positively filled with enraged Celts, pagans. And the pagans have an extremely warlike society. They never quite, the Romans rather, never quite fully managed to totally pacify all of the Celts. And the Celts kind of eke out an existence on the very edge of the Roman Empire, constantly raiding and attacking the settlements and being just a general thorn in the side of the Roman occupation. And as they are driven in front of the Roman army and not just obliterated or absorbed, the Celts are able to maintain their own unique artistic style and their own religious practices, their own worldview, and they have a very nature-based religion. Vespasian becomes emperor after Nero. Nero is the last in the line, and he's very similar in terms of uh, the way he rules to Tiberius. He savagely persecutes the early Christians all throughout the empire, and kind of rules on the Caligula kind of model um, as emperor. Vespasian comes along afterwards and marks the founding of a brand new dynasty called the Flavians, and he is succeeded in turn by his sons and Titus and Domitian. Vespasian is very significant as an emperor because it is actually he that orders the temple in Jerusalem destroyed in 70 AD, and we've talked about that already. So he has a major impact on um, the growth and the the way people look at Christianity in the ancient world. After the Flavians, there's a time period that's kind of colloquially known as the Five Good Emperors. And as near as I can tell, really, they're called the Five Good Emperors because they're not all insane, violent sex perverts like all that's gone before, but they actually care, or at least seem to care about um, not just themselves, but actually the people in the empire and the state of the empire itself. And so each one of these, and also they don't slaughter each other for each one to become um, the new emperor. There's actual succession taking place here that doesn't involve civil war and legions attacking each other. So these five good emperors, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antonius, Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, which is on a different slide. We'll talk about Marcus Aurelius in just a second, but these emperors are more interested in the welfare of the empire than themselves or chasing some obscure perversion. So Nerva, when he becomes emperor, ends uh, executions, trials for treason. These executions and treason trials were ways that the previous emperors had been controlling their political opponents. And he reverses some of the seizures of land and property that have been stolen by Domitian, and they're well liked. And no one has to be murdered for Trajan to become emperor. Now, Trajan is a military expansionist, um, but he still has he still spends a lot of his time focused on the internal constitution of the empire. Hadrian is interested in the empire's borders, but he's also extremely interested in public works. And when I say public works, I mean things like public baths, waterworks, and things like that. And the same thing is true with Antonius Pius. Um, he works with Marcus Aurelius and is kind of almost a co-ruler, but he's more of an administrator. He's actually actively participating in the empire instead of just looking at it as a source of enrichment or a toy almost. And a good example of how this works is with Trajan and Hadrian. So Trajan comes along and sets up all manner of social programs, builds all manner of public works, but he also expands the empire, adds Mesopotamia and Armenia, or the area that would today be Armenia, to the empire. He's extremely popular. And anytime you got somebody who goes out on conquests, he's almost always popular. People like victory. They like winners. And after Trajan has expanded the empire, Hadrian comes along and says, well, our border being way out there is fine and great, and it's wonderful to have an empire that's so vast and so impressive, but we have a real problem protecting all this vastness. And it's kind of the same problem that they ran into after the death of Alexander, all that way back, where you have such a huge empire, a huge land area. How do you even move troops from one side to the other if there's an attack or some kind of a crisis or what have you? So Hadrian actually reduces the borders of the empire, and he starts with England. So he quite literally cuts England in half with a huge stone wall, and in the most unimaginative name possible, it's called Hadrian's Wall. But they actually go from coast to coast in England and build this wall. And anything north of this wall is just kind of abandoned to the Celts and the Picts, who are still out there. They're still kind of raiding and unhappy with the Roman presence. But the troops, in Hadrian's opinion, are better used elsewhere. And so you can see that while they're conscious of the image of the empire and the kind of status, if you will, of the empire, they're also, the bottom line is what is actually best for the empire. Last one is Marcus Aurelius, and he's known as the first philosopher king. He's absolutely dedicated to the idea of the empire. He's a firm believer in Stoicism, which we've already talked about, and these ideas and concepts that come out of the Hellenistic expansion. And he really takes these to heart and uses these principles and ideas um, in the way that he runs the empire. He rules as co-emperor with Lucius Verus and is succeeded by his son Commodus. Now, they made a movie recently, well, not too recently, I guess, um, with oh man, his name Russell Crowe, and this guy here plays the Emperor Commodus. It's loosely based on history. Here we go again, where we have another example of a film being used to tell a historical story and not doing a very good job of it. Now, what the film does get right is that here is truly the beginning of the end for the Roman Empire. Um, After Commodus, the empire really begins to get off track, kind of militarily and socially. There's all kind of problems with food shortages and organization of the army. Commodus is not a a a good emperor like Marcus Aurelius or Hadrian or Nerva or Trajan. He is more ruling along the lines of Nero and Caligula, although not quite as extreme as those examples. But Commodus is well known for terrorizing the Senate, terrorizing elite Romans, rich people, and he did often appear as a gladiator in the arena. And that statue on the right hand side is a image of his gladiator garb. And people hate him, and he is eventually killed. And like I said, from this point on, the problems of the empire simply continue to accelerate, and the issues facing the Roman Empire become simply too great, and the long process of complete collapse really picks up. So after Commodus, the empire is never able to truly recover um, and return to the glory days of the empire. People talk a lot about the Roman Empire, but after this time period, it's really going to be a thing of the past. Now, there's one other immensely important aspect of Western civilization which truly gets rolling during the Roman Empire, and this is, of course, Christianity. So, at this time period, Judaism is kind of at a crossroad. It's it's already been around for quite a long time, and you're beginning to see a distinct break in the way Jews looked at themselves. You basically have two kinds of um, intellectual pathways. You've got Sadducees and Pharisees. Sadducees are intellectual, philosophical elites. They argue that religion depends entirely upon ritual. You have to have the temple itself. There's an elite priesthood with all manner of rituals that they conduct, and these are the things that having Judaism be successful is dependent on. The Pharisees believe that what is written in the text is the most important feature, and that not only the text be the most important part, but you should be able to open that for everyone to look at. So you wouldn't need a elite priesthood to tell you what the texts say. You should be able to encounter this literature yourself. So you have all these new ideas swirling around, and there's this one guy with a thought that totally flies in the face of all accepted dogma, and he argues that one could interpret the Bible without the help of these scholars, without this massive Jewish religious hierarchy. Furthermore, he claims that he is the personal agent of God on earth, and that as God's agent, he can offer forgiveness for sins, and that the focus must be on the Spirit, not on power, wealth, or rituals. And the ideas being espoused here naturally upset the established religious hierarchy. In fact, the established hierarchy just about lost its mind with all these radical ideas this man was teaching. So, because of this message, Jesus is seen as a heretic. He goes to Jerusalem to spread this message and deeply offends these religious officials, and is seen as undermining authority. And this is a real problem. Not necessarily the message itself, but the fact that it appears to be undermining authority, and that's a problem for both the Jews and the Romans. And he's arrested. There's a trial and an execution, and according to the religious text, after 3 days, he returns from the grave, spends about 40 days performing miracles, and then ascends into heaven. This is the condensed version of the religious story, and this story forms the foundational elements for Christianity, in such that you believe through Christ you can make a deal with God to save you from the suffering of all eternity. And this is where the idea of Old and New Testament also comes from. So, Old Testament describes the original covenant that existed between Abraham and all of his descendants, and the New Testament describes a new relationship and a kind of new covenant with people following along after the death of Christ. Now, where we sit today, Christianity is obviously one of the major religions on the planet. But in this time period, Christianity was not an accepted religion at all. And it was very much a problem for Rome because the followers simply would not worship Roman gods. That's, of course, something that they picked up from the Jews. And Christianity is underground, literally. So worshippers find themselves in catacombs, tunnels, under churches, underneath the streets of Rome, underneath burial vaults. And so in popular culture, the idea of, I've got this scene here from the Indiana Jones movie where they go down in this catacomb looking for religious relics. The the existence of these catacombs is not that far off. I mean, there's no treasure to be found in them, but still Christianity was quite literally an underground religion. And even though it's officially frowned upon, Christianity has a very strong appeal. It's certainly more open and democratic. Democratic in the sense that anyone can participate. So it's open to women, it's open to slaves. It offers hope to the powerless, and it offers a personal relationship with God. And this is a total departure from the kind of brutality and excess of Rome and Roman religion. And most of all, you have this promise of an eternal life after death. And Rome tries everything in its power to suppress this Christianity. They try exile, crucifixion, imprisonment. They burn people at the stake. They feed them to animals in the arena, lions. I mean, it's famous paintings of Christians being fed to lions. And unfortunately, or not unfortunately, that's the wrong word, but what they do is generate martyrs, and they actually strengthen people's ideology. And so this suppression and attempts to kind of squash this new religion, it simply doesn't have the intended effect. And although it's officially suppressed, Christianity spreads like wildfire. And there is a dramatic departure from Judaism and a focus on this conversion experience, this spiritual revelation, the death and resurrection of Christ. And for Christians specifically, faith in the Messiah is the only way to achieve salvation. So you've got all of these, all of the existing religious authority, all of the Jewish authority that's around at this time, kosher laws, ritual observance, circumcision, the power of the priesthood, all manner of different kind of rituals, and for the Christians, this is all meaningless. And the only thing that is important is spiritual experience, conversion, and faith. And it's only in this time period during the Roman Empire that this really picks up. And you simply cannot look at the long version of Western civilization without thinking about the role that Christianity has played. This is not to say that everyone should rush out to attend church. It's just a statement of observation that this has been an extremely powerful factor in the um, continuing evolution of Western civilization. It's just a statement of observation.